Joshua, I understand that you initially made the act of killing to tell the victims or the survivors' story of the Indonesian genocide, but then things took a turn. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, I began this project in collaboration with a community of survivors, and every time we would film together, every time we would try and talk about what happened in 1965, the military would come and stop us. I would be arrested, our crew would be arrested, our equipment would be taken, or we would be detained, and it was impossible really to get anything done. And at the same time, some of the survivors with whom I was living in this community, it was in a plantation about 60 miles from the city of Medan, where I made the act of killing, they would send me on these missions. They would send us to go film with a neighbor who they suspected or knew was a perpetrator and thought would know, for example, how a loved one had been killed. How one woman sent us to try and find out how her son was killed, someone else how her aunt was killed. And we would go on these kind of missions on behalf of the survivors to find out what had happened and encounter these perpetrators who, within minutes of meeting them, would boast about how they'd killed, about how they'd killed, the details of how they'd killed, and sometimes we'd find out how people's relatives had died. And it was, I realized then that this was this extraordinary situation. It was as though I'd walked into Nazi Germany 40 years after the Holocaust and the Nazis were still in power. The survivors, too afraid to speak, not allowed to speak. The perpetrators, at least unofficially, encouraged to boast about what they had done so that they would be these kind of feared proxies of the state. And I remember feeling this situation is so important, so not extraordinary, but important, that it demands that I give whatever it takes. And now it's about a decade on from and I've just finished this film. There was there was this moment where once when it was clear we couldn't really film with the survivors, where we went back, we took a trip to Jakarta to meet the Indonesian human rights community, which we hadn't met yet, with the survivors. And we asked, is this still too sensitive, this history? Is it too dangerous to make this film? Everybody said, no, you're onto something terribly important. We need a film for Indonesians that exposes essentially what everybody already knows, but is too afraid to say. So we need a film that comes like the child in the emperor's new clothes and says, look, the king is naked. Everybody knew it, but it's too afraid to say it. But hopefully after it's exposed by this movie, people will be able to talk about what happened and reassess, look at what happened, but also look at the nature of a regime of impunity, of corruption, of fear that's been built essentially on mass graves. So we talked, okay, how can we do this safely? And then one of the survivors said, continue to film the perpetrators, because they boast, you've seen that, and in their boasting, the audience will see exactly why we're so afraid and the nature of this regime. So I started to film every perpetrator I could find across the region, up the chain of command to the city of Medan, where I made the act of killing, and beyond, to army generals retired living in Jakarta, and found that everybody I filmed was open. Within minutes of meeting them, they would tell me these horrific stories of how they killed. And then, right after telling me how they'd killed, often in front of their grandchildren, their wives, their children, they would suggest that they take me to the places where they killed. I would accept those invitations, and then they would launch into these sort of spontaneous demonstrations of how they killed and complain afterwards that they hadn't thought to bring props. They hadn't thought to bring machetes to use as props or friends to play victims. And the questions in my head started to shift from what happened historically, which I was quickly understanding, to what is happening now, in which that the perpetrators want to be seen this way. Why are they boasting about this? For whom are they boasting? What's the function of this boasting? How do they think I hear it? How do they want their society to see them? How do they want the whole world to see them? And how ultimately do they see themselves? And really, in pursuit of answers to those questions, I proposed the following very openly to all of the men I was filming. Look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. Your whole society's based on it. Your lives are shaped by it. You want to show me what you've done. I want to understand what it means to you in your society. So show me what you've done. In whatever way you want, I'll film the process, I'll film the reenactments, and with that material, I'll try and answer these questions. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to your society? How do you want to be seen? How do you see yourself? And that's what I did. Anwar, the main character in The Act of Killing, was in fact the 41st perpetrator I filmed, and long before I met him, I was proposing this. The method was not, therefore, a kind of lure to get them to open up. It was not about giving them enough rope to hang themselves. Indeed, they had hung themselves from the very first time I filmed them. It was a way of, it was a response to their openness, an effort to try and understand why they're so open. And as I moved up the chain of command until I met Anwar, I wasn't looking for the right main character. Rather, I was exploring the nature of this impunity. And the whole journey I took with Anwar was turned out to be the core of that exploration.
What did you see in Anwar that you didn't see in the 40-some others?
I think that Anwar's pain is somehow close to the surface. And I think through the reenacting, through Anwar's boasting, it became clear something that I think was true of everybody else, which is that the boasting is not a symptom of the lack of remorse, the lack of a conscience, but in fact the opposite. It's a desperate attempt to convince oneself that what one did was right. It's Anwar's attempt to convince himself that what he did was justified. You know, there's another death squad in the film named Adi, and he says in the film, he says to Anwar, killing is the worst, and to me, killing is the worst thing you can do. But if you're paid well enough, go ahead and do it. But the key to doing it successfully is to make up an excuse so that you can live with yourself afterwards. And I think all of the perpetrators they killed, they were handed an excuse by the government justifying what they've done, and they've clung to dear life for that excuse. And in Anwar, perhaps because his pain is so close to the surface, he doesn't quite believe the excuse, and so he becomes more and more strident in the justification. The justification spills over into celebration. Perhaps with Anwar in that celebration, I thought I was catching the essence of a regime of impunity, which I think I was. And that's how the film has worked in Indonesia, unmasking this whole regime. But I think also I started to see that the paradox at the heart of all of this, which is that what appears to be a sign of the lack of remorse is the opposite. Actually, it's a sign of the conscience of the killer. And beyond that, in that paradox lies a tragedy about how we as human beings, how there's a downward spiral of corruption and evil, in that once you've killed, once you've justified, you get away with it, you justify it, you even celebrate it. It's actually because you know it was wrong at some deep level that you're celebrating it. That demands that you commit further evil. It demands that you, having thus corrupted yourself in that way, it demands that you suppress the survivors so they don't challenge your version of the events. It demands that you blame them, and then you can shake them down in markets or steal their land, which you hear about and see in the film. And it demands that you kill again, because if the army tells you now kill these people for the same reason as you killed the first, if you refuse the second time, it's tantamount to admitting that it was wrong the first time. And that's what these men have been desperately trying to run away from. So essentially you see The Act of Killing documents, witnesses the downward spiral of corruption and evil that all human beings are capable of because we have morality. Once we corrupt ourselves with an original sin, get away with it, and build our normality on the basis of the terror and lies that lie therein.
Joshua, I understand The Act of Killing is now banned in Indonesia. Is that correct?
No, it's not banned, actually.
Oh, okay.
We knew that if we released the film in cinemas, we would right after we made it, we would have to submit it to the censors in Indonesia, and we knew then that it was likely to be banned, particularly before there was any support for the film in Indonesia. Indonesia still does ban films, and in particular, they ban films dealing with human rights violations. And we knew that if the film's banned, then it becomes illegal to screen it at all, and that would be an excuse, if you like, for the paramilitary group or the army to physically attack screenings with impunity. So to avoid that situation so that the film could come out in Indonesia, all last autumn we held screenings at the National Human Rights Commission in Jakarta for Indonesia's leading news publishers, news editors, news producers, Indonesia's leading filmmakers, historians, writers, educators, human rights advocates, survivors groups. All of them really loved the film. And perhaps the most extraordinary thing happened with the news producers and news publishers. if you're the editor of Indonesia's largest news magazine, for example, you're part of the establishment, and you're in your late middle age, and you see in the act of killing men who are perpetrators, sort of the founding fathers of this regime, and you see them at the end of the film totally destroyed by what they've done, either broken, as in the case of Anwar, or in the case of Adi, the other death squad member in the film, totally hollow, empty shells. And you're faced with a pretty stark choice. Do you want to grow old like them as perpetrators, or do you want to take a stance? And news outlet after news outlet decided they would break, in reaction to the film, break their official silence on the killing, break their decades-long silence on the killings. Indonesia's largest news magazine produced a special double edition of the magazine in which they felt they should marshal fresh evidence, their own evidence, to show that the act of killing is a repeatable experiment. It documents something systemic to the society. They sent journalists all over the country, dozens of journalists, like 40, to see if they could find killers elsewhere who would talk like Anwar. To their horror, but not to their astonishment, they found that everywhere they sent journalists, there were men like Anwar who would boast. And they collected, in 2 weeks, hundreds of pages of boasting. They edited it down to 75 pages. They produced another 25 pages about the movie and came out with a double edition of their magazine on the 1st of October last year about the film. The other news outlets followed suit, and Indonesia, for the first time, has really started talking about what happened in '65. The film has come to Indonesia exactly like the child in The Emperor's New Clothes, pointing at the king, saying the king's naked. Everybody had been afraid to say it. Now it's been said so openly by the perpetrators themselves that everyone else can start talking about it without fear. So everyone who saw the film last autumn, we said, look, go back to your communities, show the film. If it's by invitation, we probably don't have to show the film to the censors. They did so on the 10th of December last year, International Human Rights Day. There were 50 screenings in 30 cities, ranging in size from 30 people as the smallest to the smallest, about 600, 700 people at the largest. That's grown ever since. On the 1st of April, we passed 500 screenings in 95 cities, and every week there's more than the previous week. So the film is really fundamentally opening this space where Indonesians can both talk about what happened and address the nature of the impunity and the fear and the corruption and the gangsterism that has been built on the celebration of atrocity as something heroic.
Can you talk about turning on the camera and approaching the subject without judgment? You'd mentioned that you spoke to these gentlemen with kindness, just they're still human beings, they still respond to, people being nice, but at some point you had to show them just who they are, and you approached it without judgment. How does a documentarian do that when they may have strong feelings about the subject?
I think that, I had a screening for this film for prison guards once in Denmark, and it was really interesting. They put words to something that I think we really as filmmakers must do whenever we look at another human being. They said, we always try to separate the crime from the person. And I never for a second suspended my judgment of the crimes. I think my moral point of view throughout the film never flags, and throughout the filmmaking never flagged. But I insisted to myself that I see these men as human beings, because I know the moment that I condemn them as monsters or see Anwar as a psychopath, what I'm doing is actually mainly reassuring myself that I'm not like them. And if the film has any core message, it's that we are all much closer to perpetrators than we like to think. Indeed, every article of clothing touching my body now is haunted by the suffering of the people who make it for us. And we know that all of them, without exception, are working in places like Indonesia, that everything we buy is produced in places like Indonesia, where there's been mass violence, where perpetrators have won, and in their victory they've built regimes of fear that keep people too suppressed to get the human cost of everything we buy incorporated in the price tag that we pay. We have stories to justify this. Economists have stories to justify this. We, I think, know it, and we tell ourselves that the trousers we're wearing are Hugo Boss and not the work of virtual slaves, but the work of a fashion designer, so as to forget the true nature of our reality. I think the film asks people to look at the nature of reality. And I knew that if for a moment I see these men as anything other than human, I'm once again escaping from the reality by telling myself I'm not like them. So I insisted to myself, I always see Anwar and his friends as human beings, and in order to deal with that, I think that I feel I can't make a film, honestly, about another human being, showing what we human beings are capable of, if I don't allow myself to get close to them. And I insisted that, okay, I will be close to him, and if for a moment I see him as a monster or a psychopath, I will stop, I will withdraw, I'll take some days off to rest, I'll come back and approach him as one human being to another. Now that was difficult, because when you become close to someone, when you become intimate with someone, of course you become vulnerable to them. And so hearing these awful stories, seeing these awful things, then gave me nightmares, because I was open to the fact that I would hope I would never do these things, but I'm very lucky never to have to find out. And so I would have these nightmares, then I would be afraid of the nightmares. That gave me insomnia for weeks, for months. And I think if I got through it, it was because of the support and the friendship and the love of my Indonesian crew in particular, who was going through much the same thing, and who, in a way, I think together we tried to light what was a very dark journey for each other with our care, with our friendship, with our laughter.